What really goes through the mind of someone who truly hates themselves? One of the most resonant themes of A Silent Voice is self-punishing guilt, the self-loathing kind that made Shouya Ishida want to disappear forever. But what led to that moment is not often understood because it was actually a hidden defense mechanism, one where feeling bad wasn't the problem, but the price. Welcome to Rediscover, where we take a closer look at our favorite anime, and today we're trying to understand our unconscious addiction to pain before it cost us everything. There's something about Shouya's story that feels deeply familiar to me. A few years ago, my friend Steve contracted a rare illness that seriously wrecked his life. Steve was a guy who couldn't live without fun, kinda like Shouya when he was a kid. But when Steve got sick, just getting through each day was an immense struggle because he was constantly in excruciating pain. There was no cure for his illness and he couldn't find a way out. And just like Shouya, he fell into deep depression. Every day, both Steve and Shouya had to answer one simple question: how do I make this pain go away? For Steve, it was a physical pain. For Shouya, it was the emotional pain of guilt and ostracism. But this is where it gets weird. I noticed that in trying to ease their pain, both of them ended up sinking deeper into it, getting stuck in what I call Shouya Syndrome. It's basically a psychological loop where a person focuses on what's not working in their lives in an attempt to fix it, but ironically ends up getting stuck in a perpetual cycle of despair. That sounds heavy, but before we can unpack how this happened to Shouya, it's really important to get one thing straight. It doesn't happen to Shouya, he actually chooses it himself. Let me explain. So I'm trained in this thing called choice theory, which was invented by a psychiatrist by the name of Dr. William Glasser. According to Dr. Glasser, emotions follow behavior and not the other way around. That means we don't just feel emotions, we generate them through the behaviors we choose. In Shouya's situation, depression isn't so much something that happens to him as much as something that he does. Dr. Glasser calls this the act of depressing, or doing depressive behavior. And that makes sense because if you think about Shouya's depression before he reconnected with Shoko, we realize that his rumination is an action, and avoiding people is an action too. But that doesn't mean Shouya was intentionally choosing his misery. What he was choosing directly were his actions and thoughts which led to those miserable feelings. Not because he was a masochist, but because depressing gave him better control over his life than whatever else he could have thought of in that situation. But why would anyone choose to depress if it makes them feel so miserable? Dr. Glasser identified 3 logical reasons that covers all kinds of depression, anxiety, and even phobias. The 3 reasons are to restrain anger, to signal distress, and to avoid difficult actions. Firstly, depressing helped Shouya to restrain his anger at his schoolmates and avoid lashing out at them in violence. Instead, he quietly judged them in his head and applied X's across their faces. Secondly, Shouya's antisocial behavior might have been an unconscious plea for help, but almost no one paused long enough to think twice about his reclusive behavior. In fact, this also explains why Shouya ended up asking Shoko to be friends by accident, because he was desperately seeking friendship and it just came out naturally. And lastly, throughout the entire time Shouya was depressing, he avoided taking the difficult action of reconnecting with other people. But here's where Dr. Glasser gets shockingly accurate, and you might want to take note because it might save a life. Like seriously. Dr. Glasser says, if a person who is depressing strongly suddenly stops depressing, but it doesn't look like he had a good reason to stop since nothing had changed in his life, then that person may have decided to end their life. So for people who have been depressing for a long time, therapists are always on the lookout if they are suddenly feeling better because they may now be thinking of suicide. The pain of restraining their anger has become so great that many people decide it's not worth living anymore and turn the anger towards themselves. But if we really want to understand someone who is depressing, we have to go beyond the why to the how and understand how Shouya Syndrome works. In this 6-step cycle, stage 1 is the trigger event, where the person is triggered by a memory or a situation that reminds them of their guilt. These events are often linked to social rejection, public exposure, or reminders of personal failure. This automatically moves Shouya to the self-reflection stage where he starts to think about his guilt. Obsessive rumination takes over, and he is repeatedly reminded of his cruelty towards Shoko. Thoughts like, "It's no use," "It's my own fault," "I haven't been punished enough," fill his mind, and he is basically watching himself fail again and again with no forgiveness. And what was originally a single unfortunate season in his early years goes through emotional amplification in stage 3 and morphs into a catastrophic failure. This is where Shouya's thoughts really start to spiral out of control. Shame, guilt, and regret all fuse together in one overwhelming emotional state. Emotional memory overrides factual memory, and the original event is magnified far beyond its actual impact. Shouya begins to feel like he alone ruined Shoko's life beyond redemption. And when this cognitive distortion occurs for long enough, this naturally pushes Shouya into stage 4, negative identity formation. Now things get really bad when Shouya stops thinking, "I did something wrong," and starts believing, "I am what's wrong." His identity becomes fused with moral failure. "I am damaged. I hurt people. I don't deserve happiness." Shouya even believed that he didn't deserve to smile when Shoko smiled at him because it would trivialize all the hurt and suffering he caused her. This negative identity paralyzed him whenever he tried to talk to Shoko, and that's also probably why he didn't pick up on Shoko's confession. Yeah, I know, a male protagonist has gotta be a bit dense to keep things interesting, but it's also pretty realistic because Shouya thought of himself as a horrible person, and never in his wildest dreams could he ever imagine that the girl he bullied would ever fall for him. And a lot of his struggles we see have to do with undoing the effects of stage 5, which is avoidance and isolation. This stage right here is the metaphorical anchor that drags Shouya down and keeps him stuck in the cycle. And the irony is that he chooses it himself because it offers him a sense of safety from the harsh world out there. Eye contact, conversation, and even casual connection feel dangerous to Shouya, and he develops a kind of hyper-vigilance which makes people seem threatening even when they're not. He chooses the pain of loneliness and self-condemnation only because it feels safer and more comforting than the potential pain of further judgment, rejection, or betrayal. So instead of repairing relationships, he avoids them altogether. I think one of the reasons A Silent Voice has grown so popular is because this problem of avoidance and isolation has only grown more severe with the growing use of social media. Cancel culture and online shaming are creating modern versions of Shouya's experience. People locking themselves in self-imposed social isolation due to past mistakes. A 2021 report by the Pew Research Center on the state of online harassment found that 64% of American adults under 30 have experienced some form of online harassment, with 75% of that number having faced more severe forms of abuse, including physical threats, stalking, and sexual harassment. As they say, social media never forgets, and this fear of permanent judgment that one's actions will haunt them forever is exactly what we see in Shouya's case. With increased avoidance and isolation comes reinforcement of negative beliefs, and that's what we see in the final stage of the cycle, reconfirmation. There are two things happening here in this last stage that turns the Shouya syndrome into a vicious cycle. There's the lack of positive feedback and the reinforcement of a negative identity, both of which are two sides of the same coin. Shouya's isolation removes any chance of a genuine friend coming along to encourage him. At the same time, the silence and distance become a kind of distorted evidence that Shouya is fundamentally unlovable. This stage is both painful and perversely comforting because Shouya feels it's right and just that he is alone because of what he's done. He accepts it as his lot in life and believes there are some things in this world you just can't attain, until the next trigger event comes along to plunge him into another round of endless despair. The scary thing is that this kind of self-perpetuating despair could start in many different ways. For Shouya, it was the guilt he carried from bullying Shoko. For some of us, it could be a breakup with a romantic partner or being stuck in a job that we really hate. For Steve, it was the loss of his health and freedom which he felt he could never recover. As he spiraled further into depression, Steve began talking about suicide as a way to end his pain once and for all. A kind of learned helplessness set in, where repeated negative trigger events made him give up and believe he was powerless to change his situation. So what could Steve and Shouya do in a situation like that? Let me know your personal experiences in the comments, but for me, I think the key to breaking out of the Shouya syndrome lies in stages 2 and 5. When someone is at stage 2, the self-reflection stage, the temptation is to ruminate about past mistakes. The problem is, rumination tricks us into thinking we are solving a problem when it's actually trapping us in guilt. So instead of focusing on the past, Dr. Glasser suggests we take ownership of our present by focusing on what we can control now. Real change takes action, so instead of feeling guilty about the past or anxious about the future, we should ask, what can I do right now? In therapy, Dr. Glasser might ask, what do you want and what are you doing to get it? The goal is not confession or guilt, but action and reconnection with others. We see this in Thor in Avengers Endgame, where he is initially wallowing in self-blame for his failure to stop Thanos. And it isn't until Professor Hulk and Rocket pay him a visit that Thor decides to channel his guilt into more meaningful action. Thor doesn't erase his past mistakes because that's not how time travel works, but he makes peace with them by making better choices in the present. For Shouya, it was Shoko who gave him the hope to live on. This is why it's so important for people stuck in the avoidance and isolation stage to get out there and reconnect with people who can offer them hope and encouragement. As Shouya tells Tomohiro in chapter 33, seeing Nishimiya again made me want to change. And with the support of his wife and family, my friend Steve also decided to put rumination aside and take positive action. He started looking for alternative treatments and accepted help from his family to try out new medications. He even took up new hobbies, and eventually, Steve enjoyed his new hobby so much that he decided to turn his newfound passion into a business where he now brings joy to others by bringing people together in a thriving community of hobby enthusiasts. And that's the beautiful irony of A Silent Voice, a film where people are not only the greatest source of pain, but also the greatest source of joy. Something that Shouya discovers as he reconnects with his former classmates is that healing itself isn't a reward, but a choice. His turning point came not when he was forgiven, but when he chose to stop hiding and start living. By taking small, deliberate actions, Shouya realized that true growth comes from accepting responsibility for personal change while refusing to be imprisoned by guilt. Shouya reminds us that we cannot erase the past. All the bad stuff we've done or tragedies that befell us will always live with us. And some problems will continue to haunt us even as new problems show up along the way. Even till the end of the movie and the manga, some people were still judging Shouya and the group of friends still had their differences. But that didn't matter to Shouya anymore because he realized that there are some things you just can't change. I know that all too well. I think it's the time you spend trying to change that's more important. And before you know it, the Shouya Syndrome will be a thing of the past as well. This video is part of my running anthology called Kill Annie in My Heart. So if you've enjoyed this one, then you're gonna love this one right here.